Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today, and I am back taking another look at Battle Angel Alita. And if you are not familiar with the basic construction of this series, I'm going to link down below to the introduction where I tell you everything I aim to do, and if you are curious about it, the terms I'm using, what I hope to accomplish by looking at this story, it's all there. Let's jump right into this. When we left off, Alita had just defeated Makaku, her first major villain. And from here, we go into the Hugo story arc. I'm going to recap that in case you're not familiar with this or the movie, but let me start by saying this is probably the story arc that the movie gets the closest to being right. In the way it presents the characters, in the way it develops their relationships, and in the way it resolves. Although, again, we're going to talk a little bit about how they kind of missed the point of some of these characters, specifically Vector. But what we really need to talk about before this is the spoilers, because there is going to be a major spoiler in here, and not just for this part of the story arc. I'm actually going to spoil what is later known as the Secret of Zalem. And that is not actually revealed in this story until just about the end. But it's necessary to discuss one of the biggest betrayals of the original story that takes place in Cameron's adaptation of the story. So, if you are wanting to read along with the story and just get it as it goes along, I will point this spoiler out in case you want to avoid it. If you haven't read this entire story before and you don't want it spoiled, just come back for my discussion of that later. But most of this is going to be just talking about the story in these pages. So if you've already read all of Volume 2, and just want to know what I think, or if you don't care about spoilers, just sit through until the end. Let's talk a little bit about Hugo. Hugo is a normal kid, at least as normal as someone can be in the scrapyard, and he makes his living by hijacking parts from cyborgs and selling them on the black market. We don't actually see him kill anyone he hijacks, but he does steal spines, which is, for whatever reason, in Kishiro's world, this is the one part of the human body you can't really cybernetically replace. Maybe. There are some full conversion Borgs that I think don't even have a human spine, but we'll talk more about them later on down the road when we talk about Den. And I have a lot of thoughts about Den and what he says about the world building as presented here. It may just be that in the scrapyard you can't get anything comparable to the human spine, and so there's a black market for this particular part of the human body. Cyborgs that have their spines removed don't die. Their artificial life support systems can still keep the brain alive, but they cannot command their body. It basically just shuts off. So Hugo is a crook, and a pretty nasty one, all things considered, considering that he may wind up stealing someone's spine, selling it on the black market, and it just coming right back to them at a huge markup, and a person basically has to pay to buy back their own body part, which is really, really weird and twisted, but fitting for this kind of a cyberpunk dystopia world. A place like Scrap Iron City, not the greatest. Now, I don't know as we were introduced to Vector in this part of the story until Hugo's storyline. I know he shows up in the movie a little bit earlier. But his introduction, he really does look a bit like a villain, as you can see here when he's introduced just as this shadowy figure and then addressing Hugo. And I have to say, I think Vector's casting in the film, it's just brilliant. Masahiro Ali really looks like Vector, and he has that same kind of very intelligent but a little oily businessman in his attitude in that movie. I really liked his performance. That's why I'm really upset that they killed him off way earlier than they should have. But the heart of this story is Hugo's relationship to Alita. And this is where we see Alita's impulses acting out against her ordered expression as a hunter-warrior. So we saw her establish herself as a hunter-warrior fighting Makaku, and she is now a creature who enforces the law for the good of the people around her. The problem is her romantic impulse drives her to Hugo. He's this kid, he's young, he's attractive, he's a dreamer, he wants to do big things. These are things that really appeal to women, and Alita is drawn to these things. It's a romantic impulse that Ito warns her against getting too close to Hugo before she knows him well. She ignores that and winds up getting really burned when it turns out that Hugo is basically a black market organ dealer. Very, very nasty stuff. And of course, in the factory, the punishment for just about anything is death. So Hugo has a death bounty on his head. And Alita, rather than bringing him in, tries to help him avoid the law. And this is where Zapan comes in. Zapan is a rival to Alita. Actually, she has a couple of rivals in this story. The other one is this really cool-looking guy in a rain hat. Let me see if I can find a good picture of him. Here's a good picture. This guy here. Ooh, look at that. Look at that. He is a nasty hunter warrior. And honestly, I mean, he's very harsh, but he's not any harsher than Alita is when she's dealing with most of her cases. He's just willing to hurt Hugo where she's not. And this puts them at odds. Alita's fight with him shows that she is willing to go way outside the lines for this particular impulse of hers. Her romantic feelings towards Hugo override her sense of order and structure to the world. And this leads her down some very dark paths. Not only does she fight with this other hunter warrior, she of course fights with Zapan, who is this guy with the weird cross hook on his head right there. You see him next to the Netman, which is kind of like a factory robot or possibly factory cyborg. I'm not sure whether Netmen have a human brain or not. Like Deckmen, who actually run the factories, do have human brains. I don't know about Netmen. They kind of look like they do. You can Kishiro is really good at showing these little bits of human skin poking out from even his most fully converted cyborgs. We saw this in Makaku as well. But Zapan is a rival in this particular case. He knows Ito, doesn't like him a whole lot, and when Alita gets in the way of some of his commissions, including Hugo, he gets upset. So, just as in the movie, just as she does in the movie, Alita winds up destroying him and throwing him down a chasm. Zapan will return in another, in Marvel style, he does come back, but he's really not important to this story going forwards. What's important about this is that unlike in the film, Zapan is following a legitimate contract. In the film, Hugo turns his back on being a body part dealer, on stealing parts from cyborgs, before Zapan tries to bring him in. In this story, Zapan plays bait, and he lets Hugo try and steal his spine, and then tries to bring him in before Alita thwarts him. This is important because this changes Alita's character development drastically. In the film, she's sticking up for Hugo as a character who has turned his back on previous evil deeds. In the manga, Hugo never turns his back on his evil ways, and Alita sympathizes with him in spite of that. This shows her immaturity, that she is not ready to balance her obligations to society with her own personal impulses. Her love for Rocky just overrides the fact that he is a terrible person in her view. And she is willing to help him survive and achieve his goals, even though he has really, really, really harmed people in doing so. And it also transforms Alita's fight with Zapan from a legitimate use of self-defense, well, maybe not under factory law, but morally speaking, a legitimate use of self-defense, into an unjustified act of aggression against another man who is just trying to do his job. Admittedly, Zapan doesn't like Alita, but that really doesn't justify her thwarting him as he attempts to bring a criminal to justice, especially a criminal who has done things like stealing people's backbones, their actual physical backbones. I really would... It's hard to sympathize with Alita through the Hugo story arc. You understand that she's driven by her feelings of love towards Hugo, and that is tragic. But Hugo's a bad dude, and he deserved pretty much everything he got. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That is my assessment. And I think the use of a character who who deserves what he gets as a tragic figure really does more service to the tragedy of the story than it does having a character who was just misunderstood. Because we see everything that Hugo could be if he hadn't been such a terrible person to everyone around him. If he had controlled himself more, if he hadn't acted so recklessly on his own impulses, he could have actually been a very good person. He may even have made the trip to Typharis. Of course, he never does. Now, let's talk for a minute about the confrontation with Vector. Because, as I've said, if you take out all the nonsense with Motorball and stuff from the movie, these story arcs play out much the same way, so there's not much to say in comparison, and I'm not interested in the beat-by-beat recap of this entire story arc. I would much rather people read that. So the assessment of this particular scene is one of my major sticking points with Alita's depiction in the film. First of all, she doesn't fight Makaku at this point. Obviously, Makaku is long dead. So the use of Griuska in the film is understandable given everything that led up to that point, given that they didn't kill him in his fight with Alita. It's understandable because here Vector calls in the Coliseum champion who replaced the one that Makaku usurped. So, I mean, if we assume that we're going to keep the big overpowering combat cyborg theme going, it makes more sense in the film to have Griuska there for continuity's sake. But here we have a new cyborg, which makes it a good bit of sense. We're familiar with this cyborg already, so it helps that we don't have to have this guy re-explained to us. And Vector just sicks him on Alita. Alita beats him up, but he doesn't. She doesn't kill him. She just kind of knocks him out. You see his head get all smushed up, but cyborgs survive much worse things in Alita's world all the time. Also, Hugo is here, and he has a confrontation with Vector that we only see in part in the film. He does demand to know whether he's been lied to all this time. Vector does tell him, like, he's a man of ambition. He's channeled his impulses to a certain extent to getting all these chips. He could do anything he wanted. The problem is he's wanted something that's just not possible with the resources available on hand. And Hugo's tragedy is not so much wanting to move beyond his station. I've seen some people say that, and it's just not true. Hugo's tragedy is that he is always looking up to the clouds and not paying any attention to what's around him. Alita could have made a good life for Hugo. They shared a lot in common. She was attentive to his needs, but he never reciprocated. He was really a bad match for her because he was completely uncaring about her, her relationship with Ito, any of her goals, if she even had goals. He painted a picture of a dream he had, and he thought that in painting that, Alita would share it. But she wasn't really attracted to his dream. She was attracted to the man who would work so hard to make that dream a reality. And Hugo misses all that, and so when he tries to make the climb to Typharis, instead of deciding it's better for him to stay with Alita, he ultimately dooms himself. He's unable to put that impulse aside and join with the people around him who offer him a different, not necessarily worse, just a different vision for what he could be. And that's why I think this is such an important moment in Alita's character growth, and one that you can't really subvert this way. You can't take away from Hugo his insensibility to the people around him. You can't make him willing to reform himself and teach Alita the same lesson, because otherwise she doesn't learn that her emotional impulses have to be tempered by her care for the people around her, by the bonds she has built with the society she is in. Hugo is a part of what teaches her that. She won't fully learn the lesson until after the Motorball arc, but since she goes and seeks out Motorball as a direct response to Hugo's death, you really can't separate the two aspects of her character development. I think that the attempt to transform Hugo into a rebel against Ty Ferris, well, that's not entirely true. I think the attempt to transform Hugo into a character who could have improved himself if he just had a little more time undercuts his message to Alita and undercuts the thematic through line of the whole story. Assuming, of course, that the movie and the manga had the same thematic through line, which they don't. And in fairness, some of the changes made to Hugo's character make sense given the thematic changes to Alita's storyline, but many of the parts of Hugo's storyline that aren't changed speak to the original through line. This impulsive, reckless relationship that he forms with Alita, her willingness to throw away everything that she has made out of herself just for this one guy. They all indicate that same kind of thematic conflict, even though the movie is poorly positioned to capitalize on it. So I don't know what you could have done to make Alita and Hugo's relationship work in Cameron's new framework. And I'm really not interested in trying to figure it out because I just want this framework back. Let's get into the spoiler talk. Let's talk about one of the major changes they made that made me absolutely certain that Cameron no longer cared about the original thematic through line. But again, I'm going to have to spoil the secret of Ty Ferris to explain this. So if you're not interested in that spoiler, this is a good place to stop. We'll get to the rest of the story at another time. Okay. The secret of Zalem is pretty simple and straightforward. As I said before, the Scrap Iron City and Zalem represent opposite points on the spectrum between complete and ossified structure, uncontestable order on Zalem's side, and complete and total chaos, complete surrender to impulse, and a complete neglect of everything around you on the Scrap Iron side. And one of the ways that Zalem's total control over citizens is represented is their coming-of-age ceremony. Every person who lives in Zalem undergoes a specific coming-of-age ceremony where they go in to the Medical Investigation Bureau and they come out with a special mark on their head. You probably noticed that on Dyson Ito. In the movie, it is there. It serves no purpose now, and I'll explain why in a moment. And of course, Daisuke Ito has it in the manga. And you also see it on Desti Nova, who is a citizen of Zalem. And that little dot shows that they've gone through the Zalem coming-of-age ceremony. And what happens during that ceremony is a person is sedated, their skull is cracked open, their brain is removed, and a microchip that contains all of their memories and personality is implanted in exchange for the brain. The brain and the microchip are connected somehow, quantum entanglement, sci-fi, woo-woo. I don't know. They're not too clear on the exact processes, how they do this duplication. The brain is put into a supercomputer matrix, and the body is released with a microchip in it to continue running their day-to-day life. The thing about putting a microchip in the brain, or in the skull, in place of a brain, is that it allows the supercomputer that runs Zalem, Melchizedek, to exert a certain amount of control over the people of Zalem. It kind of smooths off the rough edges. It makes them more likely to work with one another rather than fighting one another. And the brain that is kept in the matrix in the supercomputer has something to do with this. Again, it's all very, very super tech sci-fi, science is magic kind of stuff. The point is, people from Salem have chips for brains. They don't have physical brains. Why does this matter for what we see in Hugo's storyline? Well, in the confrontation with Vector, they're told that Salem demands 1 human's worth of body parts every month. No one's quite sure what it's for, but they do demand it. And we get a nice shot of all these human body parts in jars. In the manga, it's just a bunch of jars full of body parts. But in the movie, these body parts are taken from Chirin, Ito's wife. Except that Chirin is from Salem. We see her brain. She's supposed to have a chip for her brain if she's from the Salem of Absolute Order. But she's not. Well, I mean, she kind of is. Salem in Cameron's film represents an oppressive government, or the privileged, or the elite, or whatever powerful versus powerless dichotomy you want to put into the story. But the balancing of order and chaos was never something he was concerned with, because if he was, he would not have taken out the ultimate symbol of Salem's order that it enforces on its citizens. He would not have given them a meat brain. He would have left Chirin with a chip brain. So this is, I mean, it was really that moment. I suspected, well, there was another moment where I was sure of that, but I was absolutely certain when I saw Chirin's brain. The other moment, well, we'll talk about that during Motorball, but suffice it to say, just by the end of the Hugo story arc, you can tell for sure that Cameron had no concern for the order and chaos balancing theme that Kishiro wrote into his story. Instead, he was more concerned with the very trite modern theme of the privileged versus the oppressed. And while there's a lot of truth to that story arc, it's just so overdone, it's so trope-filled, it's so boring. It's so different from what Kishiro originally envisioned that it upsets me to no end that it was just thrown away. But that's all I got for you today on that subject. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.